I need to tell you something that happened to me 11 days ago that's going to sound absolutely impossible, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that every word is true. I was lying in a hospital bed in Nashville at 4 a.m., watching my best friend from childhood fight for his life after a drunk driver destroyed his family, when God appeared in that sterile room and answered the question that's been torturing humanity since the beginning of time. Why do bad things happen to good people? What he revealed to me didn't just answer my question, it completely healed a wound in my soul that I didn't even know was killing me. But before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps give me the strength to speak my truth. Now, let's get into my story. I'm recording this from my hotel room in Nashville, Tennessee, where I flew 5 days ago when I got the phone call that changed everything. It's 2 a.m., and I should be exhausted, but I can't sleep because what God showed me about suffering has completely revolutionized how I see every tragedy, every injustice, every moment of pain that touches human lives. Let me tell you about my friend Marcus. We grew up together in New York, two kids who bonded over being the outcasts. Him, because he was one of the few black kids in our predominantly white neighborhood. Me, because I was the weird theater kid who talked about God too much. We became inseparable, brothers by choice, if not by blood. Marcus was everything I wasn't. Athletic, confident, naturally popular once people got to know him. But more than that, he was genuinely good. Not perfect, but good in a way that seemed effortless. He was the kid who would give you his lunch if you forgot yours, who would sit with the lonely kid at recess, who would stand up to bullies even when it meant getting beat up himself. In high school, while I was pursuing acting and struggling with my faith, Marcus was volunteering at homeless shelters, tutoring kids who were failing, organizing food drives for families in need. He wasn't doing it for college applications or to impress anyone. He just couldn't stand seeing people suffer when he had the ability to help. After graduation, we went different directions, but stayed close. He became a social worker, dedicated his life to helping at-risk youth. I pursued acting and eventually landed The Chosen. But every time we talked, I was amazed by his stories. Kids he'd saved from drug addiction, families he'd helped escape domestic violence, teenagers he'd mentored who are now in college because of his guidance. 3 years ago, Marcus married Sarah, a woman who shared his heart for service. She was a nurse who worked in the pediatric cancer ward, spending her days bringing comfort to dying children and their devastated parents. Together, they were like this beacon of goodness in a world that often felt dark and broken. Last year, they had their first child, a little girl named Grace. Marcus called me the day she was born, crying with joy, talking about how becoming a father had shown him a new dimension of God's love. "Jonathan," he said, holding her in my arms, "I finally understand what it means that we're God's children. The love I feel for her, it's overwhelming." For 34 years, Marcus had been a force for good in the world. He'd never hurt anyone intentionally, never cheated or stolen or lied for personal gain. He paid his taxes, loved his family, served his community, and lived his faith quietly but consistently. If anyone deserved a life of blessing and protection, it was Marcus. 11 days ago, he was driving home from the hospital where Sarah worked. She had just finished a double shift in the pediatric ward. 16 hours of caring for children with cancer, comforting parents who were watching their babies suffer, being the hands and feet of Christ to families in their darkest moments. Baby Grace was in her car seat behind them, probably sleeping after spending the day with her grandparents. They were a family heading home after another day of serving others, talking about normal things, what to have for dinner, plans for the weekend, Grace's upcoming first birthday. The drunk driver ran a red light at 60 miles per hour and slammed directly into the passenger side of their car. Sarah died instantly. The doctors said she didn't suffer, that the impact was so severe she would have lost consciousness immediately. Grace died 20 minutes later at the hospital, her tiny body too fragile to survive the trauma. Marcus survived, but barely. Multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, traumatic brain injury. For the first week, doctors weren't sure if he would live. I got the call from Marcus's brother at 3 a.m. I was in Utah, in the middle of filming some of our final scenes for The Chosen. The moment I heard what had happened, I felt something break inside my chest, not just grief, but a kind of spiritual crisis I had never experienced before. Here was the best man I knew, someone who had spent his entire life serving God and serving others, and in one random moment his world was completely destroyed. His wife was dead, his daughter was dead, and he was fighting for his life. All because some stranger decided to get behind the wheel when he was too drunk to see straight. I flew to Nashville that same day. The first time I saw Marcus in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines, his face swollen beyond recognition, I felt something in my faith crack. This wasn't supposed to happen. Good people were supposed to be protected. People who served God faithfully were supposed to receive his blessing, not his silence in the face of devastating tragedy. For 10 days, I sat in that hospital room, watching my best friend drift in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he would ask for Sarah and Grace, and each time the nurses had to gently remind him that they were gone. Watching him realize over and over again that his family was dead was like watching someone's heart break in slow motion. The worst part was the look in his eyes when the reality would hit him, not just grief, but confusion. Marcus had always believed that God was good, that justice mattered, that living righteously somehow offered protection from random tragedy. Now, he was staring at evidence that seemed to contradict everything he had built his faith on. "Why?" he whispered to me on the 10th night, when the pain medication had worn off enough for him to think clearly. "I don't understand why, Jonathan. We were good people. Sarah spent her life caring for sick children. Grace was innocent. I've tried to follow God my whole life. Why would he let this happen to us?" I had no answer. I sat there holding his hand, this man who had been like a brother to me, and I had absolutely nothing to say that could make sense of what had happened to him. That night, after the nurses said Marcus was stable enough for me to leave for a few hours, I went back to my hotel room and had what I can only describe as a complete spiritual breakdown. Not just sadness, but rage. Rage at the drunk driver, rage at a system that let people drive drunk, rage at a God who supposedly loved people but allowed the most loving people I knew to be destroyed by random violence. I paced around that hotel room for hours, arguing with God like I had never argued with anyone in my life. How can you call yourself good when you let things like this happen? How can you ask people to trust you when you don't protect the people who serve you most faithfully? How am I supposed to portray your son as loving and just when the world you created is full of innocent suffering? I thought about all the scenes I had filmed where Jesus talks about God's goodness, about how the righteous are blessed, about how God cares for his children. In that moment, all of it felt like lies. Beautiful lies, perhaps, but lies nonetheless. Around 4 a.m., exhausted from hours of angry prayer and spiritual wrestling, I collapsed back into bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's face when he realized his family was gone. I saw Sarah's empty hospital locker. I thought about Grace's first birthday that would never come. That's when I did something I had never done before in my life. I challenged God directly, not just with questions, but with an ultimatum. "God," I said out loud to the empty hotel room, "I need you to explain this to me. Not with platitudes, not with Bible verses I've heard 1,000 times, but with real answers. Because if you can't explain why the best man I know had his family destroyed while he was serving you, then I don't know how I can keep portraying your son. I don't know how I can keep telling people you're good when the evidence suggests you're either powerless or you don't care." The room was silent. The air conditioning hummed. Outside, I could hear the occasional car passing on the Nashville streets. Normal sounds of a normal night in a world that suddenly felt completely insane. "I'm serious," I continued, feeling reckless with grief and exhaustion. "I need you to show up. I need you to help me understand why Marcus is lying in that hospital bed without his family while the drunk driver who killed them is probably going to survive with minor injuries. I need to know why Sarah, who spent her life easing children's pain, had to die in pain herself. I need to know why Grace never got the chance to grow up and maybe follow in her parents' footsteps of serving others. Still silence. Because if you can't answer those questions, I said, my voice breaking, then I don't know what I believe anymore. And I don't know how I can keep pretending to understand you well enough to play your son. The moment those words left my mouth, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The air became thicker, more present, charged with something I couldn't name but could definitely feel. The temperature seemed to shift, becoming warmer but also somehow more alive. And then, in the chair across from my bed, God appeared. Not Jesus this time, but the Father. I knew instantly who he was, even though he looked nothing like the bearded old man in Renaissance paintings. He appeared as pure love made visible, ancient wisdom given form, infinite compassion contained in a presence that somehow felt both overwhelming and completely safe. His first words weren't what I expected. "Jonathan," he said, his voice carrying the weight of eternity but the tenderness of a parent comforting a heartbroken child. "Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for bringing me your real questions instead of pretending you understand things you don't understand. Now I can show you what you need to see." God leaned forward in that hotel chair, and his presence filled the room with such overwhelming love that my anger began to dissolve before he even started speaking. But there was something else in his expression, not defensiveness or irritation at my challenge, but what looked almost like relief that I had finally asked the questions I had been carrying. "The first thing you need to understand," he began, "is that your friend Marcus is asking the wrong question. And so are you. And so is almost everyone who experiences tragedy." I felt confused. "What do you mean the wrong question?" "You're asking why bad things happen to good people, as if goodness should exempt someone from suffering. But that question assumes that the absence of suffering is the highest good, that protection from pain is the greatest blessing I could give someone. It's not." He gestured toward the window, beyond which lay the hospital where Marcus was fighting to recover. "Let me ask you this. Would Marcus be a better person if he had never experienced loss? Would his compassion for hurting people be as deep if he had never hurt himself? Would his faith be as real if it had never been tested?" I started to object, but he held up his hand gently. "I'm not saying I caused this tragedy, Jonathan. The drunk driver chose to drink and chose to drive. Evil exists in your world because love must be chosen freely, and that means people must also be free to choose selfishness, recklessness, and destructive behavior. I don't override free will, even when people use their freedom to cause terrible damage. But you could have prevented it," I said. "You could have made the drunk driver's car break down, or made Marcus leave the hospital 5 minutes later, or..." God nodded sadly. "Yes, I could have. Just like I could prevent every car accident, every disease, every act of violence. But if I did that, humans would never develop courage, compassion, resilience, or faith. They would remain spiritual children forever, never growing into the beings of love and strength they're capable of becoming." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "The second truth about suffering is that it serves a purpose you can't see from your limited perspective. What looks like senseless tragedy from Earth often serves profound purposes in the larger story of human spiritual evolution." "What purpose could Grace's death possibly serve?" I asked, my voice breaking. "She was innocent. She never got the chance to choose anything." God turned back to me, his eyes filled with infinite tenderness. "Grace's soul chose this life, Jonathan. Before she was born, before she ever took physical form, her soul volunteered for a brief but profound mission, to be loved completely by Marcus and Sarah for one precious year, and then to return home, taking their love with her." The implications of this were staggering. "You're saying she chose to die as a baby?" "I'm saying her soul understood that sometimes the greatest service to love is to teach people how precious life is, how important it is to cherish every moment. Grace's death will transform how Marcus sees every child he works with for the rest of his life. Sarah's final year of loving Grace completely will inspire how Marcus loves others. Their grief will deepen their compassion in ways that will touch thousands of lives." I struggled to accept this. But the pain they're experiencing is real, and it's terrible, and it matters deeply to me, God said, returning to his seat. I'm not minimizing their suffering. I'm explaining why I don't prevent all suffering, because suffering, when it's processed with love and support, transforms people into vessels of deeper compassion and stronger faith. The third truth about suffering, he continued, is that it reveals the difference between happiness and joy. Happiness depends on circumstances. Joy comes from knowing that your life has meaning and purpose even when circumstances are devastating. He leaned forward, his gaze intense with love. Marcus will never be happy about losing Sarah and Grace, but he will discover a joy that comes from understanding how their love prepared him to help other people navigate loss. He'll find purpose in his pain that will sustain him through the grief. The fourth truth is that what you call good people often volunteered for difficult lives precisely because they were strong enough to handle the challenges and wise enough to use their suffering to serve others. Souls don't get assigned to easy or difficult lives randomly. They choose their assignments based on what they want to learn and how they want to serve. This concept was completely foreign to everything I had been taught. So, you're saying Marcus chose this? His soul chose a life of service, knowing that authentic compassion requires understanding pain personally. He didn't choose the specific tragedy, but he chose a path that would involve loss because he wanted to develop the depth of empathy necessary to help people who are broken. God paused, watching my face as I struggled to process this. Think about your own life, Jonathan. Your struggles as a young actor, your financial difficulties, your periods of doubt and depression, didn't they prepare you to portray my son with authentic humanity? Would you be able to convey Jesus' compassion for suffering people if you had never suffered yourself? I realized he was right. My hardest seasons had taught me things about faith and perseverance that no amount of theological study could have provided. The fifth truth about suffering, God said, is that it creates opportunities for love that wouldn't exist otherwise. Right now, Marcus needs care, support, and encouragement in ways he never needed before. The people who show up for him during this crisis are experiencing the joy of serving someone they love. His tragedy is becoming their opportunity to demonstrate what love looks like in action. I thought about all the people who had rallied around Marcus since the accident, family members who had flown in from across the country, friends who were taking shifts at the hospital, his coworkers who were covering his cases, strangers who were donating money for medical expenses. Every person who responds to Marcus's tragedy with love is growing spiritually, God explained. They're learning what really matters, what genuine friendship looks like, how to be present with someone in pain. His suffering is multiplying love exponentially. The sixth truth is that what you perceive as injustice often serves justice in ways you can't see. The drunk driver who caused this accident will face consequences that may save other lives. Marcus's story will inspire changes in drunk driving laws, in hospital protocols, in how social workers support grieving families. His tragedy will prevent other tragedies. God stood again, and this time the room filled with what I can only describe as the perspective of eternity, a sense of seeing all of time simultaneously, understanding how individual events fit into vast patterns of cause and effect. The seventh truth about suffering is that it connects people to each other and to me in ways that comfort and prosperity never could. In this hospital room, Marcus is discovering who his real friends are, who can sit with him in silence, who will love him through his anger and despair. And he's discovering that I don't abandon people in their darkest moments. I meet them there. But where were you when the crash happened? I asked. Where were you when Sarah and Grace needed protection? God's expression became infinitely sad. I was there, Jonathan. I was there holding Sarah as she transitioned from her earthly body to her eternal existence. I was there receiving Grace's soul as she returned home. I was there sustaining Marcus through trauma that should have killed him. I didn't prevent their deaths, but I was present in their dying. The eighth truth about suffering is that death is not the worst thing that can happen to someone. Spiritual death, the death of love, compassion, and faith, is far worse than physical death. Sarah and Grace are alive and whole and joyful in ways they never could have been while limited by physical bodies. Marcus still has opportunities to grow, to love, to serve that would be lost if he died now. I felt tears streaming down my face as I began to understand what he was saying. So, when we grieve, we're not really grieving for them, we're grieving for ourselves. You're grieving the loss of relationship in its earthly form, God confirmed, and that grief is appropriate and necessary. But if you could see Sarah and Grace now, if you could understand the fullness of their existence and the joy they're experiencing, you would grieve differently. You would grieve your loss while celebrating their graduation. The ninth truth about suffering, God said, his voice becoming softer, is that it's temporary in ways that the good it produces is eternal. Marcus's pain will eventually heal, but the compassion he develops through this experience will serve people forever. Sarah's death will inspire better care for families facing medical crises for generations. Grace's brief life will motivate countless acts of love and service. He returned to his seat and looked directly into my eyes. And the 10th truth is the most important one. Suffering is not evidence that I don't love people. Suffering is evidence that I love them enough to allow them to grow into the fullness of who they're capable of becoming, even when that growth requires walking through pain. God reached out and touched my heart, and suddenly I could feel what he felt when he watched human suffering. Not indifference, not detachment, but overwhelming love and compassion mixed with confidence that every pain served a purpose, that every loss contributed to a larger story of redemption and growth. I don't enjoy watching my children suffer, Jonathan. Every tear they cry breaks my heart. But I love them too much to keep them in spiritual infancy by protecting them from every challenge. I love them enough to trust them with difficult assignments because I know they're strong enough to handle them and wise enough to use them for good. The room began to feel like it was shifting, and I sensed our conversation was nearing its end, but God had one more thing to say. The question isn't why bad things happen to good people. The question is, how will good people respond when bad things happen? Will they let suffering make them bitter or compassionate? Will they let loss isolate them or connect them more deeply to others who are hurting? Will they let tragedy destroy their faith or refine it into something stronger and more authentic? He stood to leave, but before he disappeared, he said something that changed everything. Marcus will choose how his story ends, Jonathan. His tragedy is the beginning of his story, not the conclusion. Watch and see what kind of man emerges from this fire. Watch and see how many lives are touched by someone who learned to love at the deepest level because he first learned to grieve at the deepest level. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in that hotel room with the most profound understanding of suffering I had ever experienced. I sat in that hotel room for hours after God left, processing everything he had shown me. The anger I had carried for 11 days was completely gone, replaced by something I had never felt before, a deep peace about suffering that didn't minimize its reality but understood its purpose. When I returned to the hospital the next morning, I saw Marcus differently, not as a victim of random tragedy, but as someone whose soul had volunteered for an assignment that would require extraordinary strength and produce extraordinary compassion. The man lying in that hospital bed wasn't just my best friend recovering from injuries. He was a spiritual warrior being forged in the fire of loss. Marcus was awake when I arrived, staring at the ceiling with that look of devastation I had seen so many times over the past week. But this time, instead of sitting in helpless silence, I knew what to say. "Marcus," I said, pulling my chair close to his bed, "I need to tell you something that happened to me last night." I shared everything. My spiritual crisis, my angry confrontation with God, the visitation, the 10 truths about suffering. I told him about souls choosing difficult assignments, about how his tragedy would multiply love exponentially, about how Sarah and Grace were experiencing joy beyond anything possible in physical existence. At first, he looked at me like I had lost my mind. "You're telling me that Grace chose to die as a baby? That Sarah volunteered for this?" "I'm telling you that their souls understood something we don't, that love, given completely, even for a short time, serves purposes we can't imagine." that their deaths will save lives, inspire changes, deepen compassion in ways that ripple out for generations. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing what I had shared. Finally, he said, "I can't feel that truth yet, Jonathan. Right now, all I feel is emptiness and rage. But there's something about what you're saying that doesn't make me angrier. It makes me curious." Over the next few days, I watched something extraordinary begin to happen. Marcus started asking different questions. Instead of, "Why did this happen to me?" he began asking, "How can I honor their memory by the way I respond to this?" Instead of, "Where was God when I needed him?" He started wondering, what is God trying to teach me through this experience? The shift was gradual, but it was real. Marcus began talking about Sarah's work with pediatric cancer patients, how she had helped so many families navigate loss and trauma. She knew how to sit with people in their worst moments. He said, she knew what to say and when to say nothing. Maybe this is teaching me how to do that too. 3 days later, a social worker from the hospital came to check on Marcus. She was overwhelmed, carrying too many cases, clearly burned out from trying to help families deal with medical crises without adequate support. Marcus, still connected to machines and barely able to sit up, began talking to her about her work. "How do you handle seeing so much pain every day?" he asked. For the next hour, this exhausted social worker poured out her heart to Marcus about the challenges of her job, the families she couldn't help enough, the children she had watched die despite everyone's best efforts. And Marcus listened, really listened, not from his own need, but from genuine concern for her burden. When she left, she hugged him carefully and said, "Thank you. I haven't had anyone ask about my struggles in months. Everyone always talks about the families we serve, but nobody thinks about how hard it is on us." That's when I saw it, the first glimpse of who Marcus was becoming through his tragedy, someone whose own experience of devastating loss was already beginning to make him more attuned to other people's pain. The physical healing took months. Marcus had to relearn how to walk, had to work through brain injury complications that affected his memory and coordination. But the spiritual transformation was evident from the beginning. Every therapist, every nurse, every doctor who worked with him commented on something unusual about his attitude. Most people with this level of trauma become angry and difficult, his physical therapist told me. But Marcus seems determined to heal, not just for himself, but so he can help other people who go through what he's going through. 6 months later, Marcus returned to work. But he didn't just return to his old job. He developed a new program specifically for families dealing with sudden loss. Using his experience with grief, his understanding of trauma, and the compassion he had developed through his own suffering, he began helping people navigate the darkest moments of their lives. The first family he worked with was a couple whose teenage son had been killed in a school shooting. They were exactly where Marcus had been 6 months earlier. Destroyed by senseless tragedy, angry at God, questioning everything they had believed about justice and goodness. "I know what you're feeling," Marcus told them, "because I've been exactly where you are. And I want you to know that you're going to survive this, not because the pain will go away, but because you're going to discover strength you didn't know you had and purpose you never imagined." He shared his story, not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone who had walked through the fire and emerged with deeper capacity to love others who were burning. Within a year, Marcus's program was helping dozens of families. The hospital where Sarah had worked established a foundation in her name to provide better support for families of pediatric cancer patients. The changes they implemented based on Marcus's insights have since been adopted by hospitals across the country. The drunk driver who killed Sarah and Grace was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but more importantly, Marcus's public forgiveness of him, his testimony about choosing healing over hatred, has been used in victim impact programs that have prevented countless other drunk driving incidents. Now, 2 years later, Marcus has become one of the most effective grief counselors in the region. People seek him out specifically because they know he understands loss at the deepest level. His capacity for compassion, his ability to sit with people in their darkest moments, his conviction that meaning can be found in even the most senseless tragedy, all of it was forged in the fire of his own devastating loss. Last month, He called me with news that brought tears to my eyes. "Jonathan," he said, "I'm getting married again. Her name is Rebecca. She's a widow who lost her husband in a construction accident 3 years ago. We met in a grief support group, and we've been helping each other heal. Are you ready for that?" I asked. "I'll never stop loving Sarah," he said, "but I've learned that love isn't diminished by loving again. If anything, losing Sarah taught me how precious love is, how important it is not to waste opportunities to give and receive it. Rebecca understands that. She's not trying to replace Sarah. She's honoring her memory by loving me well. They're planning to adopt children, kids who have lost their parents, who need the kind of love that can only come from people who understand loss personally. Grace will always be my daughter," Marcus told me. "But there are other children who need parents, and Sarah and I always talked about adoption. I think she would want me to love other children in her memory." As I've watched Marcus's transformation over these 2 years, I've come to understand what God meant when he said that good people often volunteer for difficult lives. Marcus's tragedy didn't destroy him. It revealed who he really was underneath his comfortable life. It showed him depths of strength and compassion he never knew he possessed. And I've realized that the same is true for everyone who faces serious suffering. The question isn't why bad things happen to good people. The question is, will good people let bad things make them better? Maybe you're listening to this and you're going through your own devastating loss. Maybe you're angry at God, questioning whether he's good, wondering why someone who tries to live righteously has to endure such pain. I want you to know that your anger is valid. Your questions are legitimate. Your pain matters deeply to God. But I also want you to consider the possibility that your suffering isn't evidence that God doesn't love you. It's evidence that he trusts you with an assignment that will require everything you have to give. Maybe you're someone who lost a child, and you can't imagine how their death could serve any good purpose. I want you to know that their life mattered, that their love is still changing things, that they continue to exist in ways that transcend physical death. And I want you to consider that your grief, when it's processed with support and love, might become your qualification to help other parents who face the same devastating loss. Maybe you're someone who survived an accident that killed people you love, and you're struggling with survivor's guilt, wondering why you were spared when others weren't. I want you to know that you survived for a reason, not because you're more deserving, but because you have work left to do that requires the wisdom that comes from walking through trauma. Maybe you're someone watching a loved one suffer from disease, and you're tormented by their pain, angry that God isn't healing them. I want you to understand that healing comes in many forms, sometimes physical, sometimes spiritual, sometimes in the form of deeper love and stronger faith that emerges from walking through illness together. The 10 truths God taught me that night in Nashville have become my framework for understanding every tragedy I encounter. First, the absence of suffering isn't the highest good, the presence of love is, and love is often deepened through shared struggle. Second, suffering serves purposes we can't see from our limited perspective. What looks senseless often serves profound spiritual development. Third, souls choose difficult assignments because they want to develop extraordinary compassion and strength. Fourth, suffering reveals the difference between happiness and joy. Happiness depends on circumstances. Joy comes from knowing your life has meaning, even when circumstances are devastating. Fifth, tragedy creates opportunities for love that wouldn't exist otherwise. People grow spiritually by responding to others' suffering with care and service. Sixth, what appears to be injustice often serves justice in ways we can't immediately see. Individual tragedies often prevent larger tragedies. Seventh, suffering connects people to each other and to God in ways that comfort never could. Community is forged in crisis. Eighth, death isn't the worst thing that can happen to someone. The death of love, compassion, and faith is far worse than physical death. Ninth, suffering is temporary. The good it produces is eternal. Pain eventually heals, but the growth it creates serves forever. 10th, suffering isn't evidence that God doesn't love us. It's evidence that He loves us enough to trust us with assignments that will develop us into our highest potential. But the most important thing I learned is that how we respond to suffering determines what it produces in our lives. Marcus could have let his tragedy make him bitter, angry, and closed off from love. Instead, he chose to let it make him more compassionate, more present, more committed to serving others who are hurting. That choice, the choice to let suffering refine us rather than destroy us, is available to everyone who faces loss. It's not easy, and it's not immediate, but it's possible. Father God, I pray for everyone listening who is walking through their own season of suffering. For those who are angry at you, help them know that you can handle their anger and that it doesn't change your love for them. For those who are questioning your goodness, help them see that allowing growth through challenge is the highest form of love. For those who have lost people they love, comfort them with the knowledge that love is eternal, that consciousness continues, that reunion is certain. For those who are caring for people who are suffering, strengthen them and help them see that their service is sacred work. Help all of us to understand that suffering is not your punishment, but your trust in our capacity to grow through difficulty. Help us to choose responses that honor both our pain and our potential. Help us to believe that meaning can be found in even the most devastating circumstances when we're willing to let love transform our losses. Thank you for loving us enough to trust us with hard assignments. Thank you for being present in our pain even when we can't feel you there. Thank you for the promise that all suffering is temporary, but all love is eternal. In Jesus' name, amen. The truth I learned in that Nashville hotel room is the truth that has the power to transform anyone's relationship with suffering. Bad things don't happen to good people because God doesn't love them. Bad things happen to good people because God loves them enough to trust them with opportunities to develop extraordinary compassion, strength, and capacity to serve others who are hurting. Your pain has purpose. Your loss has meaning. Your suffering can become your qualification to help heal a broken world. Thank you for letting me share what may be the most difficult but most important truth I've ever learned. I love you all, and God loves you enough to trust you with whatever you're facing.